The sky over Eldridge was a dreary slate gray as Jonathan Graves parked the van outside the dilapidated town hall. The small Texas town, barely known outside its own borders, seemed to be crumbling under its own weight, mirroring the crumbling building before him. Jonathan's team, each clutching a piece of their ghost hunting arsenal, emerged from the van, their faces a mixture of curiosity and trepidation. "Welcome to Eldridge," Jonathan said, surveying the town's forlorn main street with a wry grin. "Let's hope it lives up to its reputation." Emily Carter, the team's tech expert, squinted at the surrounding buildings through her thick glasses. "I'm not sure what's creepier, the fact that this place is straight out of a horror film or the fact that we're supposed to be the protagonists." Alex Ramirez, the team's seasoned investigator, adjusted the straps on his equipment bag. "Hey, I've had worse assignments. Remember the abandoned asylum in Indiana? That place was a real dump." Sarah Nguyen, the research specialist, clutched a stack of files and documents, her expression serious. "Let's focus on why we're here. We received a tip-off about supernatural disturbances in St. Aidan Sanctuary, and if the rumors are true, this place is crawling with more than just cobwebs." Jonathan led the team into the town hall, where they were greeted by Officer Daniels. His uniform was crisp, but his eyes betrayed a deep-seated unease. The man seemed to be in his late 40s, with a weathered face that spoke of years spent in a job that was no longer comforting. "Mr. Graves, I'm Officer Daniels," he said, extending a hand that trembled slightly. "I'm afraid the situation at the church is quite serious." Jonathan shook his hand. "We've heard the basics. Something about disappearances and disturbances." "Yes, and more," Daniels replied, his voice dropping to a whisper. "St. Aidan's has a dark history, not just the usual ghost stories, but something more sinister. I strongly advise you to be cautious." Emily, always eager to test her equipment, interrupted. "Caution is my middle name. Actually, it's not, but it should be. I just need to know where the church is so I can set up my gear." Daniels pointed down the road. "It's a few miles out of town. You'll see it. Just don't expect a warm welcome." "Perfect," Alex said, grabbing his flashlight and adjusting his gear. "Sounds like we're going to be the first guests to the world's worst Airbnb." The drive to the church was as unsettling as the town itself. The road wound through thick woods, the trees casting long shadows that danced in the fading light. As they approached, the site of St. Aidan's Sanctuary loomed ahead, its Gothic spires reaching into the sky like skeletal fingers. The church's windows were dark, and the front door hung ajar, creaking softly in the wind. "This place gives me the chills," Emily said, her voice laced with a hint of apprehension. "And not the good kind." Jonathan nodded, his eyes fixed on the building. "Let's get to work. We'll split up. Sarah and I will check out the sanctuary. Emily, you and Alex can set up the equipment and check the perimeter." The team proceeded with their tasks. Jonathan and Sarah entered the church, stepping into a cavernous interior shrouded in darkness. Dust motes danced in the narrow beams of their flashlights, and the air was thick with the smell of mildew and decay. The once grand altar was now a shadow of its former self, covered in grime and cobwebs. "Not exactly the Ritz-Carlton," Sarah remarked dryly, her voice echoing in the empty space. "More like the Ritz-Carlton's haunted cousin," Jonathan replied, scanning the room with his EMF meter. "Let's see what we're dealing with." As they began their initial sweep, Emily and Alex were outside, setting up cameras and motion detectors. Emily's fingers deftly worked over her equipment as Alex cracked jokes. Are we sure this place isn't a tourist attraction for the undead? Alex asked, adjusting a camera on a tripod. Emily smirked. If it is, they're doing a terrible job with the marketing. No ghostly concierge to welcome us. Back inside, Jonathan and Sarah discovered a set of old documents tucked away in a dusty drawer beneath the altar. The papers were yellowed and brittle, detailing strange rituals and accounts of disappearances linked to the church. "This doesn't look good," Sarah said, her brows furrowing as she read the notes. "It seems like the church was involved in some pretty dark practices." Jonathan nodded. "We'll need to dig deeper. But for now, let's see what the equipment picks up." Suddenly, a cold draft swept through the church, and the temperature dropped noticeably. The EMF meter went haywire, its needle swinging wildly. "Looks like we've got company," Jonathan said, his voice steady despite the chill. Sarah took a deep breath. "Well, if we're lucky, they'll be friendly ghosts. But something tells me we're not that fortunate." The tension in the air was palpable as the team prepared for what would undoubtedly be a night filled with more than just supernatural phenomena. Little did they know, the horrors lurking within St. Aidan's sanctuary were only beginning to unfold. The night had settled over Eldridge like a heavy, suffocating blanket. The church's silhouette loomed against the dark sky, and the only sounds were the distant rustling of leaves and the occasional creak of the old building. Inside St. Aidan's sanctuary, the team's equipment cast eerie shadows as they continued their investigation. Jonathan Graves and Sarah Gwynn were inspecting the church's sanctuary. The vast room was filled with worn pews, their surfaces covered in a thick layer of dust. The air was musty, and the atmosphere was thick with the palpable weight of years of neglect. Sarah carefully unrolled a map of the church's layout that she had found among the old documents. "It looks like there are a few areas we haven't explored yet," she said, tracing her finger along the faded ink. "There's a crypt below the altar and some old passageways leading to the bell tower." Jonathan glanced around, his EMF meter still flickering erratically. "Let's start with the crypt. If there's any place where we might find something significant, it's down there." As they made their way to the altar, the floorboards groaned beneath their feet. The staircase leading to the crypt was narrow and steep, illuminated only by the dim light of their flashlights. "So, let me get this straight," Sarah said with a dry smile. "We're going down into a dark, potentially haunted crypt to find out what exactly." "Just trying to find answers," Jonathan replied with a smirk, "and maybe avoid becoming ghosts ourselves." They descended the stairs, and the temperature dropped even further. The crypt was a small, stone chamber, lined with old sarcophagi and worn inscriptions. The air was colder and smelled faintly of earth and decay. Emily Carter and Alex Ramirez were outside, busy setting up more cameras and motion sensors around the perimeter of the church. Emily adjusted a camera with a practiced hand, while Alex fiddled with a voice recorder, mumbling to himself. "I swear, if this thing picks up any more static, I'm going to lose it," Alex said, rubbing his temples. Emily chuckled. "Maybe the ghosts are just camera shy, or they've taken up a new hobby, like causing electrical interference." Alex grinned. "Great. As if dealing with ghosts wasn't enough, now we've got to worry about their avant-garde tech habits." Back inside, Jonathan and Sarah were examining a particularly worn sarcophagus when Sarah's flashlight flickered and went out. Jonathan's flashlight, too, sputtered before steadying. "Great," Sarah said, trying to restart her flashlight. "Nothing like a little technical malfunction to keep us on edge." Jonathan pulled out his backup flashlight. "Well, if we're lucky, The ghosts are too polite to mess with us directly." The two continued their search, uncovering a small compartment hidden behind one of the sarcophagi. Inside, they found an old journal, its leather cover cracked and faded. Sarah carefully opened the journal, revealing handwritten notes and sketches. This looks like it belonged to someone who was heavily involved in the church's activities. There are references to rituals and, before she could finish, a sudden crash echoed through the crypt. Jonathan and Sarah exchanged startled glances, their flashlights casting erratic beams across the walls. "What was that?" Jonathan asked, his voice tense. Sarah scanned the area. "We should check it out. But let's be careful." They made their way back to the sanctuary, where Emily and Alex were already on high alert. "We heard something down here," Jonathan said, his voice steady despite the growing tension. "Did you guys pick up anything on the cameras?" Emily checked her monitor, her face pale. "Actually, yes. We've got some unusual readings, significant spikes in EMF, and one of the cameras caught something moving in the bell tower." Alex rolled his eyes. "Well, that's just great. Nothing like a ghostly game of hide and seek." The team decided to investigate the bell tower next. The stairs were narrow and winding, the wooden steps creaking under their weight. The air grew colder with each step, and an unsettling silence enveloped them. When they reached the top, the bell tower was filled with old equipment and dusty remnants of past eras. The large bell hung ominously in the center, its metal surface tarnished and worn. "Looks like we've found the jackpot," Alex said, looking around. "If ghosts like to hang out in dusty, forgotten places, this is their ideal hangout spot." Sarah moved towards the bell, her flashlight revealing old symbols etched into the metal. These symbols matched some of the ones we saw in the crypt. It's like a map of their dark practices. Emily, examining the equipment, suddenly shrieked, "Guys, you need to see this!" Jonathan and the others rushed over. On the monitor, the cameras had captured a shadowy figure moving swiftly across the room. It seemed to dart from one corner to another, barely visible. "Okay, this is officially unsettling," Jonathan said, trying to mask his anxiety with a wry smile. "We've got a shadow on camera. Ghost or just a figment of our imagination?" Sarah looked at the monitor, her face set in grim determination. "We need to find out what that shadow is. This place is hiding something, and I have a feeling it's more than just an old bell and dusty books." The team's sense of unease grew as they realized that whatever was haunting St. Aidan's sanctuary was more active and more dangerous than they had anticipated. With each step deeper into the mystery, the line between the natural and the supernatural blurred, and they knew that unraveling the truth would require facing their deepest fears. As they prepared for their next move, the weight of their investigation settled heavily on their shoulders. The darkness of the sanctuary seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, a stark reminder that they were far from alone in their quest to uncover the truth. St. Aidan's sanctuary seemed to breathe with an eerie life of its own as the team moved deeper into its decaying depths. The bell tower, with its shadowy figures and unsettling atmosphere, had left everyone on edge. But if the previous night had been unnerving, the dawn brought no relief. Rather, it promised more dread. Jonathan Graves and Sarah Gwynn sat in the church's main hall, reviewing the footage from their cameras. The flickering images on the monitor showed fleeting shadows and inexplicable anomalies. Emily Carter and Alex Ramirez were in the church's basement, where they had set up additional cameras and sensors. Emily looked at Alex, who was holding a clipboard filled with cryptic notes. "I've seen less action at a chess club." But this place, it's something else. Alex smirked, his face lit by the glow of their equipment. You mean, aside from the occasional ghostly shadow and disappearing people? Definitely not your typical Sunday afternoon. Emily's gaze remained fixed on the monitor. The thing is, the EMF readings are off the charts. And there's this constant low-frequency hum I can't explain. Maybe the ghosts are just trying to communicate in Morse code, Alex suggested dryly. Emily chuckled, though the sound was strained. If they are, they're terrible at it. Upstairs, Jonathan and Sarah were poring over the old journal they had found in the crypt. The symbols and rituals described within were disturbing, hinting at ancient practices and sacrifices. None of this sounds like casual Sunday church activities, Sarah said, her tone laced with dry humor. More like a manual for summoning the supernatural. Jonathan flipped through the brittle pages. It's clear that something very dark was going on here. We need to figure out if these rituals had any lasting effects. The two moved cautiously through the sanctuary, their footsteps echoing through the empty hall. The shadows cast by their flashlights seemed to dance along the walls, as if they were alive. Jonathan's flashlight beam landed on a series of markings along the floor, barely visible beneath the dust. "Hey, take a look at this," Jonathan said, pointing to the markings. "These don't match anything from the journal, but they're definitely significant." Sarah examined the symbols closely. "These are more recent. Someone's been here recently." Before they could investigate further, Emily's voice crackled over the radio. "Guys, you might want to see this. We've got some serious activity down here." Jonathan and Sarah made their way back to the basement. As they descended the stairs, the air grew colder, and the sound of their footsteps seemed unnaturally loud. Emily and Alex were already gathered around the monitor, which showed an alarming series of events. "Look at this," Emily said, pointing to a section of footage where a shadowy figure moved erratically. "This thing is moving with purpose, not just a random glitch." Alex adjusted the volume on the recorder. "We picked up something strange too. It's not just visual. There's an audible component." Sarah frowned as she listened to the recording. "That sounds like whispers, and not in any language I recognize." Jonathan glanced at the monitor. "Okay, so we've got a ghost that not only has a flair for the dramatic, but also seems to be trying to communicate. Or maybe it's just trying to scare us." Emily sighed. "Well, if it's a communication attempt, it's a very elaborate one. We need to figure out what it wants." The team decided to split up again to cover more ground. Jonathan and Sarah would investigate the crypt once more, while Emily and Alex would examine the bell tower and surrounding grounds. In the crypt, Jonathan and Sarah carefully examined the hidden compartment they had discovered earlier. Jonathan's flashlight flickered intermittently as they searched for more clues. "You know," Sarah said, her voice echoing off the stone walls, "if there's a ghostly realm, I bet it's got better interior design than this." Jonathan chuckled. "Probably. Though, judging by the state of this place, it's more of a do-it-yourself kind of ghost." They continued their search, discovering more old documents and a small ornate box. Inside the box were a series of strange artifacts, tarnished coins, small bones, and an old pendant inscribed with mysterious symbols. "Looks like we've found something," Jonathan said, holding up the pendant. "Any ideas?" Sarah examined the pendant closely. It might be a key, either literal or metaphorical. The symbols could represent a ritual or a way to communicate with whatever is here. Meanwhile, Emily and Alex were in the bell tower, where the temperature had dropped significantly. Emily adjusted a camera, while Alex inspected the old equipment. "Feels like we've stepped into a freezer," Alex remarked, rubbing his arms. "If the ghosts don't get us, frostbite might." Emily frowned as she reviewed the camera footage. "There's definitely something moving around up here, but it's not easy to track." A sudden crash from above made both of them jump. The sound was followed by an unsettling silence. "Did you hear that?" Emily whispered. Alex nodded, his face pale. "Yeah, let's check it out, but let's try not to attract any more attention." They climbed the remaining steps to the top of the tower, where they found the large bell swaying slightly, as though it had been recently disturbed. The shadows in the corner of the room seemed to twitch and shift unnaturally. "This place is seriously creepy," Alex said, trying to maintain his composure. "And I'm starting to think our shadowy friend might be a little more than just a trick of the light." Emily set up additional cameras, her hands shaking slightly. "Agreed. Whatever is here, it's not playing around." As they continued their investigation, the sense of unease grew. The ghostly presence in St. Aidan's sanctuary was more active and more malevolent than they had anticipated. With each passing hour, the line between the supernatural and the real seemed to blur further, and the team knew that the answers they sought were buried deep within the darkness. St. Aidan's sanctuary seemed to be holding its breath as night fell once more. The church, now fully under investigation, was becoming increasingly unsettling. The shadows cast by the waning light seemed to stretch and writhe, as if they were alive. Jonathan Graves and Sarah Gwynn were back in the crypt, their breath visible in the freezing air. They had set up their equipment and were examining the artifacts they had discovered. Jonathan held up the pendant they had found. "This thing feels heavy. I don't mean physically, I mean spiritually. There's something about it that just doesn't sit right." Sarah examined the pendant with a skeptical look. "It could be a key to something, but to what? Or perhaps it's a symbol, like the ones we saw earlier." Jonathan nodded. The journal mentioned rituals and sacrifices. "Maybe this pendant is part of those practices. We need to figure out its purpose." They moved to the crypt's altar, where Sarah had found another set of markings. Jonathan started scanning the symbols with an EMF reader, hoping to detect any changes in the electromagnetic field. "I'm getting some readings," Jonathan said, holding up the device. "But nothing substantial. It's almost as if the source of the activity is hiding from us." Sarah sighed, her flashlight casting long shadows across the walls. "Hiding or simply waiting? I'm starting to think this place is less about ghosts and more about something deliberately malevolent." Elsewhere, Emily Carter and Alex Ramirez were investigating the bell tower. The bell's ominous presence loomed over them, casting a shadow across the room that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. Emily adjusted her camera, her face set in concentration. The bell is the focal point of the tower's energy. Whatever is happening here seems to be centered around it. Alex, inspecting an old, dusty book that he'd found among the debris, frowned. "This book looks like it hasn't been touched in decades, and it's filled with more of those weird symbols." Emily took the book from him and started flipping through the pages. "It's a grimoire, a book of rituals. This is definitely not what you'd find in a Sunday school class." A sudden noise from the corner of the room made them both jump. The cameras caught a flicker of movement, something dark darting behind the bell. "Not sure if it's a spirit or just a rodent," Alex said, trying to hide his unease. but I'd prefer it to be the latter. Emily scanned the area with a thermal camera, her eyes widening as she spotted a cold spot moving rapidly across the room. Whatever it is, it's not exactly friendly. Back in the crypt, Jonathan and Sarah had unearthed a hidden compartment beneath the altar. Inside, they found old, dusty tomes and a collection of what appeared to be ceremonial items. "These look like they haven't been touched in ages," Jonathan said, pulling out an ancient dagger and a ceremonial robe. "But they're in pristine condition, almost like someone has been maintaining them." Sarah's eyes narrowed as she examined the items. "These are likely used in the rituals mentioned in the journal. They might be the key to understanding what's really going on here." The room grew colder as if acknowledging their discovery. The temperature plummeted, and the shadows seemed to stretch and writhe more aggressively. Jonathan shivered. "Feels like the place is reacting to us. We should get this stuff back to the main hall and analyze it." They carefully transported the items to the church's main hall, where Emily and Alex had just returned. The team regrouped and began analyzing their findings. "Looks like you guys have had some luck," Emily said, noting the items with interest. "And we've got some new footage that might help." She played the recording from the bell tower. The footage showed a dark figure moving rapidly, its form shifting and elongating. The figure seemed to be interacting with the bell, causing it to sway violently. "Great," Jonathan said, rubbing his temples. "So not only do we have a shadowy figure, but it also seems to be connected to the bell. This is starting to look like a bad horror movie." Sarah frowned at the footage. "It's not just any shadow. It's purposeful, almost like it's trying to communicate or lead us somewhere." Emily nodded. "We need to figure out what it wants. But first, we need to understand the significance of the bell and the items we've found." Jonathan turned his attention to the ceremonial items. These could be part of the rituals described in the grimoire. We should try to recreate the rituals and see if they reveal anything. As they prepared to set up their equipment for the ritual, the atmosphere in the church grew increasingly tense. The darkness seemed to press in on them, making every creak and whisper sound more ominous. "I'm not one to complain, but this place is seriously messing with my nerves," Alex said, adjusting the camera. "If ghosts are trying to get our attention, I think they've succeeded." Sarah gave a dry chuckle. "I'm sure they're just waiting for the right moment to make their grand entrance." The team set up the ceremonial items in the center of the main hall, carefully arranging them according to the instructions found in the grimoire. As they began to perform the ritual, the air grew heavy with an oppressive energy. Jonathan recited the incantations, his voice steady despite the growing unease. "If there's any truth to these rituals, let's hope it's more enlightening than horrifying." As the last words of the incantation were spoken, the church fell eerily silent. The temperature dropped even further, and the shadows seemed to pulse with a malevolent force. The team waited, their breaths visible in the icy air, as they hoped for answers. The oppressive darkness around them seemed to grow even more intense, as if the very walls of St. Aidan's sanctuary were closing in on them. Whatever they had awakened, it was not taking kindly to their intrusion. The oppressive darkness of St. Aidan's sanctuary seemed to weigh down on the team as they prepared for the final confrontation. The church, now more ominous than ever, was alive with an unsettling energy. The shadows moved with purpose, and the temperature had plummeted to an almost unbearable chill. Jonathan Graves, Sarah Gwynn, Emily Carter, and Alex Ramirez stood in the main hall, their faces illuminated by the flickering light of their equipment. The ceremonial items were arranged in a circle, their significance still uncertain but increasingly urgent. Jonathan, trying to maintain a semblance of calm, glanced at the other members of the team. "All right, we've done everything we can. If there's any truth to the rituals, we should be prepared for anything." Sarah adjusted her flashlight and took a deep breath. "You mean, prepared for the ghosts to come out and play?" Emily's gaze was fixed on the bell tower, where the shadows seemed to twist and writhe with increasing intensity. "The bell tower's energy is off the charts. It's where we should focus our attention." Alex, ever the skeptic, quipped, "Great. So if we don't get possessed by the end of the night, I'll consider it a success." The team moved cautiously towards the bell tower. As they ascended the stairs, the air grew colder and a low guttural sound echoed through the narrow staircase. The shadows on the walls seemed to stretch and twist, reacting to their presence. At the top of the bell tower, the large bell swayed slightly, its motion disconcerting in the stillness. Emily set up a series of cameras to capture any anomalies, while Jonathan and Sarah prepared the ceremonial items for a final attempt to understand the forces at work. As they began their preparations, the temperature dropped sharply. Jonathan shivered, feeling the weight of the malevolent energy pressing in on them. "It's as if the very air is thick with dread." Sarah nodded, her face pale. "I've never felt anything like this before. It's like being watched by something far worse than any ghost." Emily, focusing on the cameras, said, "We need to be ready for anything. Whatever is here, it's not playing nice." The team gathered around the bell, the centerpiece of their investigation. Jonathan recited the final incantations from the grimoire, his voice steady despite the growing unease. The room was filled with an almost tangible tension, and the shadows seemed to pulsate with a dark energy. Suddenly, the bell began to toll. The sound was deafening, resonating through the tower and shaking the very foundation of the church. The shadows on the walls seemed to converge on the bell, forming a dark, swirling mass. "Here we go," Jonathan said, his voice barely audible over the clamor of the bell. Emily's cameras captured the swirling shadows, revealing a dark figure coalescing from the mist. The figure, a shadowy silhouette with unsettlingly human features, moved with a purpose that was both menacing and purposeful. "Is that what I think it is?" Alex asked, his face etched with fear. Sarah's eyes widened as she recognized the figure. "It looks like the entity we've been seeing in the footage, but it's more solid now, more real." The figure moved towards them, its presence radiating an overwhelming sense of malevolence. The air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to close in around them. "We need to act fast," Jonathan said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Whatever this thing is, it's drawing power from the bell." The team worked quickly to complete the ritual, their movements coordinated despite the growing chaos around them. Emily chanted the final incantations, her voice barely audible over the sound of the bell. The dark figure seemed to react violently, its form writhing and shifting as if in pain. The shadows around them grew darker, more oppressive, as if trying to smother the light. Suddenly, the bell's tolling ceased. The shadows recoiled, and the temperature began to rise. The dark figure let out a final, tormented wail before dissipating into the ether. The room fell silent, the oppressive darkness lifting slightly. The team, exhausted and shaken, looked at each other with a mixture of relief and apprehension. "Did we do it?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. Jonathan wiped his brow, his face pale. "I think so. The entity seems to be gone, but we need to analyze the data and make sure." Alex, still visibly shaken, added, "If we did, I'd say it's time to get out of here before anything else decides to drop by." The team packed up their equipment, their movements slow and deliberate. The sanctuary, though still eerie, seemed less hostile. The oppressive energy had lifted, leaving behind an uneasy calm. As they exited the church, the first light of dawn began to filter through the clouds. The night had been long and fraught with danger, but they had faced the darkness and emerged victorious. Jonathan took one last look at the church, its once menacing presence now reduced to a shadow of its former self. "We came here seeking answers, and we found them, but some mysteries are better left undisturbed." Sarah nodded in agreement. "And some places are better left in the past." The team left St. Aidan's sanctuary behind, their spirits both relieved and wary. The shadows had been unveiled, but the darkness of the past had left its mark on them. They knew that while they had confronted the malevolent forces of the sanctuary, the echoes of their encounter would linger long after they had gone.